You think you know a man by the way he sips his whiskey, by the calluses on his hands, by the stories he chooses to tell. My family, they thought they knew me. They saw an old man, softened by time, a comfortable piece of furniture in the sprawling, too quiet house his money had built. They saw a wallet with legs, a patriarch to be humoured, a relic to be patiently waited upon. They never saw the puppeteer, not until it was far, far too late. Let me tell you something about control, real control. It isn't about shouting orders or making threats. Any brutish fool with a temper can do that. No, true control is subtler. It's the art of the unspoken promise. It's the gentle pressure of a hand on a shoulder that says, behave, and this could all be yours one day. It's the strategic silence that follows a foolish question, a silence so heavy with disappointment, it feels like a physical weight. For 70 years, I built an empire from nothing but grit and a willingness to do what others found distasteful. I didn't sweat and bleed and crush my competitors just to see my life's work frittered away on my grandson's sports cars and my daughter-in-law's boutique psychotherapy practice. A man's legacy shouldn't end at the grave. It should be his finest, most enduring performance. The diagnosis was the curtain call. Pancreatic cancer, swift and merciless. The doctor, a young man with the earnest eyes of someone who hasn't yet learned that some news can't be softened, laid it out with clinical precision. 6 months, maybe 9 with aggressive treatment. I thanked him, drove home in my silent Rolls-Royce, and poured 3 fingers of a Macallan so old and expensive it tasted of history and peat smoke. I didn't feel fear. I felt a profound, exhilarating clarity. The final act was upon me, and I had a lifetime of strings to tie up, or rather, to leave untied, ready for my hands to pull from beyond the veil. The family gathered, of course. They descended upon the house with a cloying, performative sadness that made my teeth ache. My son, Robert, 55 years old and still waiting for his life to begin, a man whose greatest ambition was to be a competent steward of another man's fortune, had spent his life in the placid, shadowed waters of my empire, never venturing out into the risky, open sea of building something of his own. He sat by my bed, his hand patting mine, his voice a low, soothing murmur filled with talk of doctors, second opinions, positive energy. All I heard was the anxious thrum of an heir counting the days. His wife, Cynthia, my daughter-in-law, a woman who had married into money and devoted her life to spending it with the focused intensity of a military strategist. Her grief was a tasteful, black designer dress, her concern a series of carefully rehearsed lines. "Was so worried about you, Semio," she'd say, her eyes already calculating the square footage of a potential vacation home in the south of France. A home my death would finally make attainable. Then there was Elara, my granddaughter, 27. A beautiful, hollow thing. She had the attention span of a gnat and the depth of a puddle. Her world was a shimmering bubble of social media influencers, exclusive club openings, and a rotating cast of boyfriends who were all teeth and trust funds. She cried, of course, genuine tears, I believe, but they were not for me, not for the loss of her grandfather. They were for the potential interruption of her funding. The thought of having to get a job, a real one, was a tragedy far greater than my impending mortality. And finally, there was Thomas, the black sheep, or so he liked to think, my grandson, Elara's older brother, 30 years old, with a philosophy degree and a permanent sneer. He thought himself a revolutionary, an anti-capitalist crusader, living in a cramped apartment, filled with the smell of patchouli and his own unearned superiority. He refused my money on principle, he said, a principle he could afford to hold precisely, because he knew it was there, a safety net woven from the very capitalism he professed to despise. He'd visit, his face a mask of contemptuous pity, and lecture me on the moral bankruptcy of my wealth. I'd just smile and listen, adding another mental note to my grand design. His hypocrisy would be his own special leash. They were my audience, my caste, and they were utterly oblivious to the play I was writing for them. The key, you see, was not to disinherit them. That would have been a crude, blunt instrument. It would have caused a brief, messy scandal, and then they would have been free. Robert would have gotten some middling executive job. Cynthia would have downsized. Elara would have married the first wealthy idiot she could find, and Thomas would have worn his disinheritance like a badge of honor. All while secretly seething, they would have escaped my control. I could not have that. No, my masterpiece was far more elegant. I would give them everything. Absolutely everything. I summoned my lawyer, Alistair Finch, a cadaverous man with a mind like a steel trap, and a loyalty that was, thankfully, purchased and maintained by exorbitant fees over 4 decades. He was the only one who knew the full scope of my intentions. He was to be my executor, my proxy, my hands in the world of the living. The document we crafted was a thing of beauty, a Rube Goldberg machine of legal clauses, trusts, stipulations, and conditional allowances. The entirety of my estate, the holding company that owned my various businesses, the real estate portfolio, the investments, the art, the liquid assets, everything was poured into an irrevocable trust, the Semio Perpetual Legacy Trust. The family would be the beneficiaries. They would want for nothing, but they would control nothing. The reading of the will was held in my own library. A week after the funeral, the air was still thick with the lila they'd piled around my coffin. They sat there, the 4 of them, on the leather Chesterfield, their faces pale and expectant. Robert, trying to look dignified in his grief. Cynthia, already mentally redecorating. Elara, sniffling into a tissue. Thomas, looking bored, as if he were above it all. Finch, perched behind my own mahogany desk, cleared his throat. He adjusted his spectacles and began to read in his dry, precise monotone. He started with the small bequests, the charitable donations, a necessary bit of stage setting. The tension in the room was a physical thing. One wish I could have seen it. I was there, of course. In a manner of speaking, my portrait, a stern and imposing thing it had painted a decade ago, glared down at them from over the fireplace. Finally, he got to the heart of it. Article 7, the disposition of the residual estate, Finch intoned. I could see Robert sit up straighter. Cynthia's hand crept to her throat. Elara stopped sniffling. Even Thomas glanced up from examining a loose thread on his sleeve. I, Semio Alistair Locke, being of sound mind, Finch read, and I could almost hear their internal cheers. Sound mind. Thank God. The old fool didn't lose his marbles at the end. Do hereby bequeath the entirety of my residual estate, including all real property, corporate holdings, securities, and personal effects, to the Semio Perpetual Legacy Trust, of which my descendants, namely my son Robert Michael Locke, my daughter-in-law Cynthia Ann Locke, my granddaughter Elara Faith Locke, and my grandson Thomas Samuel Locke, shall be the sole lifetime beneficiaries. There was a collective, shuddering exhale. Robert's shoulders slumped in relief. A small, triumphant smile touched Cynthia's lips. Elara let out a little gasp of joy. Thomas merely shrugged, but I saw the flicker of relief in his eyes. The safety net was still there. The great whale had been harpooned, and the bounty was theirs. Then Finch continued, the trust shall be administered by a sole trustee, who shall have absolute and final discretion over all matters pertaining to the trust's assets and distributions to the beneficiaries. The appointed trustee is my long-time legal counsel, Alistair Finch of Finch, Coburn and Weiss. Robert's head cocked slightly. Administered, he said, his voice hesitant. Alistair, what does that mean, exactly? I'm the executor of the will, am I not? This is just a formality to avoid probate. Surely. Finch looked over his spectacles, his expression unreadable. No, Robert, you are not the executor. I am. And this is not a mere formality. The trust is the legal owner of all assets. You are a beneficiary. My role as trustee is to manage those assets and to disperse funds to you and your family according to the terms set forth by your father. The room went very, very quiet. The only sound was the ponderous tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. According to what terms? Cynthia asked, her voice sharp, the mask of grief slipping to reveal the calculating woman beneath. Finch picked up a much thicker sheaf of papers, The terms are quite detailed. I will provide you each with a copy. But in summary, the trust provides each of you with a monthly allowance, the amount of which is determined at the sole discretion of the trustee, based on a review of your needs and circumstances. Allowance. Robert barked the word as if it were an insult. He stood up, his face flushing. I'm 55 years old, Alistair. I don't need an allowance. I need to run my father's company. I am the CEO. The company is an asset of the trust, Robert, Finch said calmly. As trustee, I now chair the board. Your position as CEO is, of course, secure, pending a review of quarterly performance metrics outlined in Schedule C. Your salary remains unchanged. However, all capital expenditures, strategic pivots, hiring of C-suite executives, and any business investment over $50,000 requires my approval as trustee. Robert looked as if he'd been slapped. He sank back onto the couch, his mouth agape. He wasn't the master of the house. He was the head janitor, a glorified employee. What is my allowance? Elara asked, her voice small and frightened. For you, Elara, Finch said, consulting the document. As a non-employed beneficiary, the base allowance is set at $4,000 per month. $4,000, she shrieked. That's not even enough for my car payment. That's impossible. What about my apartment? My credit cards? Your apartment lease, held in the trust's name, will be paid directly. Your American Express Platinum card, also held by the trust, has been cancelled as of this morning. You will be issued a debit card linked to your monthly allowance account. Any expenses beyond your allowance must be applied for in writing, with receipts, for the trustee's consideration. Elara burst into tears, real ones this time, the kind born of genuine, world-shattering panic. Thomas actually laughed, a short, bitter sound. Of course, the old man's final joke. Hayes turned you all into dependents. I told you his generosity was a poison. He stood up. Well, it doesn't affect me. I want nothing to do with it. You can keep his blood money. Fink's voice stopped him at the door. Thomas, the trust is for all descendants. Your share is allocated. Your base allowance, as an employed individual, is set at $2,000 per month. Thomas turned, his face a thundercloud. I don't want it. I won't take it. That is your prerogative, Finch said evenly. However, should you choose to refuse the distributions, the funds will not be redistributed to the other beneficiaries. They will be reinvested into the trust's capital. Furthermore, your refusal will be noted as a voluntary relinquishment of all future benefits, including any potential lump sum distributions upon the eventual dissolution of the trust, decades from now. The choice is yours. Thomas stood frozen, his principles warring with a deep, human instinct for security. He was trapped. To refuse was to make a meaningless gesture that would only cost him. To accept was to become what he hated. I had him. I saw the moment he realized it. The defiance drained from his face, replaced by a look of utter defeat. He walked back and slumped into a chair, saying nothing. Cynthia found her voice. It was cold, steady, and dripping with venom. Alistair, this is monstrous. This is its emotional tyranny from beyond the grave. There must be a way to challenge this. He can't do this. Finch met her gaze. He can, Cynthia. He did. The will has been through probate. The trust is ironclad. Your father-in-law was very thorough. He anticipated every possible challenge. To contest this would be lengthy, astronomically expensive, and almost certainly unsuccessful. The legal fees would be drawn from your allowances. The finality in his voice extinguished the last flicker of hope in the room. They sat there, the four of them, surrounded by the opulence my money had bought, and understood they were paupers in a gilded cage. They had everything, and they had nothing. It was the most satisfying moment of my life, and I wasn't even there to see it. Not in the flesh, anyway. The first month was a symphony of chaos, and I had the best seat in the house. Finch reported everything to me, of course. Well, not to me. To my portrait. He'd come into the library once a week, pour 2 glasses of my Macallan, set one beneath the painting, and give me a detailed report. It was our little ritual. My posthumous board meeting. Robert tried to flex his muscles at the company first. He attempted to push through a merger he'd been eyeing for years, a pet project he was certain would be his legacy. Finch, upon review, sent a one-line email. Trustee does not approve. The strategic risk is not justified. Robert stormed into the library, where Finch was working at my desk, and raged about short-sightedness, about stifling innovation. Finch simply steepled his fingers. Robert, the trust's primary mandate is capital preservation, not speculative growth. Your father was quite clear on that point. The answer is no. I need to speak to my father, Robert had shouted, his face purple. Finch had merely glanced up at my portrait. I'm afraid that's no longer possible. The fight went out of him then. He understood. I was everywhere and nowhere. I was in the fine print of every contract, in the balance of every account, in the very air he breathed. He was a ghost in his own life. A CEO who couldn't buy a new printer without filing a request in triplicate. Cynthia's rebellion was more social. She was humiliated. How could she lunch with the other wives at the club when she had to ask permission to buy a new handbag? She tried to circumvent the system. She maxed out her personal credit card, a paltry thing with a $20,000 limit, assuming the trust would be forced to pay it to avoid the scandal of her default. Finch let the statements go to collections. He let the threatening calls from the credit card company home to the house. Finally, a letter arrived from a law firm. The shame was too much for her. She went to Finch, tearful and furious, and he advanced her the money from her allowance for the next 5 months to pay it off, at a nominal interest rate, as per trust guidelines on fiscal irresponsibility. She learned her lesson. Her social standing was important, but not as important as her comfort. She became docile, her spending cautious, her requests humble. She learned to beg. Alara's descent was the most spectacular. $4,000 was a death sentence. Her life was a curated collection of experiences and things, and the funding had been abruptly cut off. Her friends, the leeches, drifted away when she could no longer pick up the tab at the club. The boyfriend vanished. She couldn't afford her yoga classes, her spa days, her personal stylist. She was a ghost in the world she once ruled. She came to the house, sobbing, to see Finch. "Please, Amar." "Finch," she begged. "You don't understand. I need more. I'll do anything. I can't live like this." Finch, from behind my desk, was implacable. "The allowance is set, Alara. However, the trust does have a program for incentivizing personal development and financial independence." She looked up, a flicker of hope in her red-rimmed eyes. What do I have to do?" -1D outlines a matching program for earned income. For every dollar you earn from gainful employment, the trust will match it, dollar for dollar, up to a ceiling of $5,000 per month. "Get a job," she whispered, horrified, as if had suggested she sell a kidney. "It is one path to increasing your disposable income," Finch said, sliding a printed list of job openings from a temp agency across the desk. She left, crumpling the paper in her hand. A week later, desperate, she applied for a receptionist position at a dermatology clinic. She got it. She hated it. She had to wake up at 7, wear flat shoes, answer phones, and be polite to people she deemed beneath her. But her first paycheck, for $1,300, was matched by the trust. She had $2,600, plus her base allowance. It wasn't glory, but it was survival. I'd given her a taste of self-reliance, and she hated it, but she needed it. She was learning the value of a dollar. My dollar. Thomas was the most amusing. He held out for 3 weeks. He made a grand show of it, I'm sure. But then, reality began to bite. His ancient laptop died. His beta of a car needed a new transmission. His roommate moved out, leaving him with the full rent. Principal doesn't fix a carburetor. He finally slunk into Fink's office, his face a mask of humiliation. "The allowance," he muttered, not meeting Fink's eyes. "I'll take it." "Of course," Finch said. "Direct deposit has already been set up. It will begin this month. There is, however, a condition for beneficiaries receiving distributions while publicly disparaging the benefactor or the trust. Thomas looked up, wary. What condition? A morality clause, of sorts. Your social media profiles are monitored by a service retained by the trust. Any public post, tweet, or statement that negatively characterizes your grandfather, the trust, or the source of your funds will result in a 50% reduction of your following month's allowance for a first offense, and a full suspension for a second. Thomas' jaw dropped. You're monitoring my speech. That's fascism. It's the terms of the trust, Thomas. You are free to speak your mind, but not on the trust's dime. The choice, as always, is yours. He left, seething. But the next day, he went silent online. The fiery posts about capitalist pigs and inherited privilege ceased. His revolutionary fervor was quieted by a $2,000 monthly wire transfer. I had bought his silence. The greatest victory of all. This was the new normal. They were learning their roles. Robert, the managed executive. Cynthia, the humbled socialite. Elara, the working girl. Thomas, the silenced revolutionary. Their strings were pulled by memos from Alistair Finch, by the impersonal logic of the trust, by the ghost in the machine. But I wasn't finished. A puppeteer cannot simply set the strings and walk away. He must direct the play. He must introduce new elements, new conflicts, to keep his puppets dancing. The base allowances were just the beginning. The real control was in the special dispensations, the rewards and punishments I had baked into the fabric of their new lives. It was time to make my presence felt a little more directly. It was time for the first test. A puppeteer must never be complacent. The initial shock of the strings is potent, but familiarity breeds, if not contempt, then at least a dangerous adaptability. My family was learning the new boundaries of their cage. They were bruised, resentful, but they were starting to figure out the rules. Robert was learning to submit his proposals in the correct format. Cynthia was learning to itemize her grocery receipts for reimbursement. Elara was learning to endure the soul-crushing tedium of her job. Thomas was learning to bite his tongue. This would not do. Comfort, even the comfort of miserable resignation, was the enemy of my design. They needed to be kept off balance, uncertain, forever looking over their shoulders at the ghost holding their leash. True control isn't just about enforcing rules, it's about owning hope. You have to dangle the carrot, even if you never, ever let them take a bite. I began with Robert. His was the most fragile ego, the one most tightly wound to the idea of his own competence. Had been a good son, in his way, obedient, had never rebelled, never tried to strike out on his own, had simply waited, a prince in a gilded antechamber, for the king to die and leave him the throne. Now he found the throne came with a regent who held absolute veto power. His frustration was a low, constant simmer. I decided to turn up the heat. Through Finch, I'd been monitoring the quarterly reports from the holding company. There was a mid-level project manager in the logistics division, a woman named Sarah Evans, sharp, ambitious, and utterly stifled by the company's ossified hierarchy. She had submitted a proposal 6 months before my death, a complete overhaul of our supply chain management, using a new, AI-driven software platform. It was bold, it was expensive upfront, and it was exactly the kind of innovative, forward-thinking project Robert always paid lip service to, but was too risk-averse to ever actually greenlight. Head shelved it, with a polite, condescending note about revisiting it during the next budget cycle. It was perfect. Finch summoned Robert to the library. My son arrived, his posture a mix of weary resentment and forced deference. He hated coming here, hated seeing Finch sitting in my chair, hated the portrait of me, watching his every move. Robert, Finch began, not offering him a seat. I've been reviewing the queue to logistics reports. The inefficiencies in the Southern California distribution hub costing us nearly $40,000 a month in delayed shipments and overtime. Robert sighed. A practiced, put upon sound. I'm aware, Alistair. It's a legacy system issue. We're working on incremental improvements. It's on the agenda for the next operational review. Incremental improvements are no longer sufficient, Finch said, his voice like chipping ice. He tapped a folder on the desk. I have here a proposal from a Sarah Evans, an AI integration platform. The initial investment is substantial, but the projected annual savings are in the millions. Why was this shelved? Robert's face tightened. He recognized the name. That proposal. Alistair. It's wildly speculative. The tech is unproven. The disruption to implement it would be massive. It's a gamble we simply can't afford to take right now. The trust can afford it, Finch replied coolly. And the trustee's mandate is long-term growth and efficiency, not short-term risk aversion. I am approving the project. You will inform Ms. Evans that she is promoted to Director of Logistics Optimization. Effective immediately, she will report directly to you, and you will provide her with every resource she requires. I want a weekly progress report on my desk. I wish you could have seen his face. It was a masterpiece of conflicting emotions, outrage that his authority was being so blatantly overruled, panic at being forced to undertake a project he didn't believe in, and underneath it all, a searing, humiliating jealousy. He should have had the vision to see the project's potential. He should have been the one to champion it. Now, some junior woman head dismissed was being handed the reins, and he was being ordered to hold her coat. This is a mistake. Alistair, he sputtered. You're undermining my authority. The team won't respect a directive that comes from outside the chain of command. Finch fixed him with a dead-eyed stare. The directive comes from the owner of the company, Robert. The chain of command begins and ends with this desk. Your job is to execute. Do you have a problem with execution? It was the perfect question. The only acceptable answer was no. To say yes was to admit incompetence, to invite his own replacement. He was trapped. He swallowed his pride. A painful, visible gulp. No, he muttered, his eyes dropping to the floor. No problem. Good. See that it's done. Robert slunk out of the library, a defeated general. But here is the beautiful part. A few weeks later, the first progress report came in. The project was ahead of schedule. Sarah Evans was a dynamo. She was brilliant, driven, and because she'd been handed this opportunity by the mysterious, all-powerful trustee, she was fiercely, fanatically loyal to me, to the idea of me, and Robert. He started to see her success as his own. He began to mention his new logistics initiative, calls to board members. He took a proprietary interest in her triumph. I had forced him to swallow a bitter pill, and his own ego had convinced him it was a vitamin. He was dancing, and he didn't even know who was pulling the strings. I had given him a project to succeed at, and in doing so, I had reinforced his absolute dependence on my approval. The puppet masters his own pride. Cynthia was next. Her punishment for the credit card fiasco had been effective, but it had made her sullen and reclusive. She was avoiding her social circle, terrified of the humiliation of being seen as less than flush. This was unacceptable. A hermit doesn't feel the sting of social pressure. I needed her back in the game. I needed her to want things she couldn't have, so I could have the pleasure of denying her. The opportunity came with the annual Grove Park Conservancy Ball. It was the social event of the season for her set. The chairwoman this year was Eleanor Vanderwoodson, a woman Cynthia had been engaged in a silent, vicious Cold War with for 20 years over, who was the true queen of their particular social hill. To not attend would be a defeat. To attend without the means to compete would be a humiliation. She spent a week working up the courage to approach Finch. She came into the library wearing her most reasonable, humble expression. Alistair, she began, her voice sweetened with a false warmth that made me nauseous even in my disembodied state. I'm sure you're aware of the Conservancy Ball next month. It's for a wonderful cause, and it's really rather a mandatory event for someone in my position. Finch looked up from his papers. And what do you require, Cynthia? She took a delicate breath. Well, my allowance, it's perfectly adequate for day-to-day, of course. But an event like this, there's the ticket, which is $5,000 for a couple. Then there's the new gown. One simply can't be seen in last year's. And hair, makeup, a car for the evening. You've drawn up a modest budget. She slid a piece of paper across the desk. She'd listed $25,000. Finch didn't even look at it. The trust does not cover discretionary social expenses of that magnitude. Her composure cracked. Discretionary. Alistair, this is my life. This is about maintaining the social standing that Semio himself worked to build. What will people think if I'm not there? They'll think we're in trouble. That could impact business relationships. The trust's business relationships are not dependent on your attendance at a charity ball, Finch said, utterly unmoved. The answer is no. She left, white-faced and trembling with rage. For 2 days, she moped around the house, a storm cloud of self-pity. I watched her through the security cameras I'd had installed in every room, a necessary tool for any conscientious posthumous patriarch. She was on the verge of giving up. So, I applied a little pressure. The following day, a large, flat box was delivered to the house. Finch, acting on my instructions, had it sent to the library. He called Cynthia in. "A delivery for you, Cynthia," he said, his tone neutral. Frowning, she opened the box. Inside was a gown. Not just any gown. It was a breathtaking, floor-length masterpiece of midnight blue silk and hand-sewn crystal beading from a designer so exclusive. There was a 3-year waiting list. It was the exact dress she had pointed out to me in a magazine over a year ago, sighing. Now that is what I'd wear to rule the Grove Park ball. She gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Alistair, I don't understand. It seems your father-in-law purchased this for you some time ago." Finch lied smoothly. "It was found in a storage closet with your name on it. A posthumous gift, it would seem." Tears welled in her eyes. Real ones, for once. She held the dress against herself, spinning slightly in front of the mirror over the fireplace, her reflection framed by my stony gaze from the portrait. She saw victory. She saw reinstatement. She saw herself outshining Eleanor van der Woodson and reclaiming her throne. "Oh, Semio," she whispered, a genuine tremor of affection in her voice. "You old devil." You remembered. Then she turned to Finch, her expression triumphant. "Well, there you have it. The dress is taken care of. Now, about the tickets and the rest." Finch's face didn't change. "The dress is a gift from beyond the grave. A lovely gesture. The tickets and associated expenses remain discretionary. They are not covered." The triumph on her face melted into sheer, unadulterated horror. She looked from the unimaginably expensive dress in her arms to Finch's implacable expression. She understood. I had given her the weapon, but I had handcuffed her arms. She had the gown to rule the ball, but no way to get in the door. She could hang it in her closet and look at it, a constant, exquisite reminder of everything she could not have. It was cruelty so specific, so personalized. It was practically art. She didn't say a word. She just carefully, slowly, folded the dress back into its box, her movements robotic. She picked it up and walked out of the library, her head held high, but her shoulders slumped in a defeat, so total it was almost beautiful. She didn't go to the ball. The dress stayed in the box. Every time she opened her closet, it mocked her. I had given her hope, just so I could watch it die. The puppet yearns for the beautiful prop, but the puppeteer decides if she gets to hold it. Alara's transformation was the most fascinating to observe. The forced employment was having an effect I hadn't entirely anticipated. The initial horror had given way to a grudging competence. She was still a receptionist, but she was a good one. She was organized, surprisingly good with the frantic patients calling about their Botox appointments, and she'd even streamlined the filing system. Her boss, a pragmatic woman who didn't care about Alara's last name, had given her a small raise and more responsibilities. This was a problem. I didn't want her to find satisfaction. I wanted her to feel the friction of her reduced circumstances every single day. Her punishment was meant to chafe, not to build character. I instructed Finch to activate the next phase. He called her into the library. She arrived looking tired, but composed, still in her work clothes, a simple blouse and skirt, a far cry from the designer outfits of her previous life. "Alara," Finch said, offering her a seat for the first time. She took it, wary. "I've received the report on your earned income. The trust will be issuing its matching funds for last month." "Well done." She nodded, a hint of pride in her eyes. Thank you, Mr. Finch. However, he continued, and I saw her tense. A review of your living situation has been completed. The trust is currently paying $7,200 a month for your 2-bedroom apartment on Coronado Drive. It's a good neighborhood, she said defensively. It is, but it is an excessive expense for a single person. The trust's mandate is fiscal responsibility. Therefore, your lease will not be renewed when it expires next month. Her composure broke. What? You can't. That's my home. Where am I supposed to go? Finch slid a sheet of paper across the desk. It was a list of apartment complexes. These are properties within a reasonable commuting distance to your employment that fall within the new housing budget the trust has allocated for you. She scanned the list, her face falling further with each line. These are studios. These are on the east side. This one is above a laundromat. The budget for your housing allowance is now $1,500 a month, Finch said, his voice devoid of sympathy. You may use your earned income and your trust allowance to supplement that if you wish to upgrade. The choice is yours. She was being evicted from the life she knew, forced down another rung on the ladder. The pride she'd felt from her job evaporated, replaced by the cold reality of her situation. She was a working girl who couldn't even afford a decent apartment. She found a place, a cramped studio in a building with thin walls and the persistent smell of fried food. She had to sell most of her furniture because it wouldn't fit. She cried when the movers took her beloved sectional sofa away. I watched it all on a live feed from the camera I'd had installed in her new apartment, a necessary condition of the trust paying the rent. She sat on the floor, surrounded by boxes, hugging her knees and sobbing. Good. Let her cry. Let her feel the distance between what she was and what she had been. I had yanked her string, and she had stumbled. The puppet feels the floor disappear beneath her feet. Thomas, my little revolutionary, was the toughest nut to crack. His silence had been purchased, but his resentment was a radioactive core inside him. He took the allowance, but he hoarded it. He didn't upgrade his life. He didn't buy a new laptop. He fixed the car himself with parts he bought second-hand. He was living on rice and beans, using the trust's money to fund his pathetic little activist meetings, printing pamphlets that railed against the very system that was putting food in his mouth. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. He was the worst of all of them, a hypocrite who thought he was a hero. He needed a lesson in consequences, a real one. I had Finch dig deeper. We already monitored his social media. Now we started monitoring his associations. He was part of a loose collective that organized protests against urban development, against corporate polluters, generally against anything that smelled of money and power. Harmless, for the most part. A bunch of kids shouting at the moon. But then he got involved with a new group, more militant, more organized. They were planning a direct action at the construction site of a new office building being developed by one of my subsidiary holding companies. They weren't just going to protest, they were going to try to sabotage equipment, delay construction, cost me money. Thomas didn't know it was my site. The ownership was buried under layers of corporate obfuscation. He thought he was striking a blow against a faceless corporation. He was, in fact, preparing to vandalize his own inheritance. This was perfect. It was time to bring the revolution home. The night before the action, Finch summoned Thomas to the library. Thomas arrived smelling of cigarette smoke and self-righteousness. He didn't sit down. What does the overlord want now? He sneered. Finch ignored the tone. Thomas, I am instructing you to cease all association with the group known as the Clearwater Collective, and to cancel your plans for tomorrow evening. Thomas froze. His eyes widened slightly, then narrowed in suspicion. I don't know what you're talking about. We have a transcript of your planning meeting from last night at the cafe on Elm Street, Finch said calmly. You were quite detailed in your assignment. You're to cut the fuel lines on the bulldozers. The trust cannot be associated with, nor will it fund, criminal activity. You're spying on me. Thomas hissed, his face contorted with rage. You're having me followed. The trust protects its assets. You are an asset. Your actions have consequences. Stand down, Thomas. Or what? Thomas challenged, taking a step toward the desk. "You'll cut off my allowance. Go ahead. I don't care. This is bigger than money. This is about justice." "No," Finch said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was far more threatening than a shout. "It's not about justice. It's about you being a fool. Do you know who owns the development at the West 25th Street site?" Thomas shrugged. "Some shell corporation. They're all the same. The owner is Lock Holdings, subsidiary venture group IV," Finch said. "A wholly owned entity of the Semio Perpetual Legacy Trust. Your trust. The equipment you were planning to vandalize is your equipment. The delays you cause will cost you money. You are not striking a blow against the system. You are a beneficiary of the system attempting to vandalize his own property. It's the most privileged, idiotic form of protest I have ever encountered." The color drained from Thomas' face. He stumbled back a step, as if physically struck. That's a lie. You're lying to stop me." Finch opened a folder and slid a series of corporate ownership documents across the desk. Thomas' eyes scanned them, his bravado crumbling with each page. He saw the trail. He saw the truth. He wasn't a revolutionary. He was a shareholder throwing a tantrum. I didn't know," he whispered, his voice hollow. "Ignorance is not an excuse," Finch said, retrieving the documents. "The action is cancelled. You will never speak of this again. You will dissociate from that group, and you will report to the West 25th Street construction site manager next Saturday at 8 a.m. Thomas looked up, confused. "What? Why?" "For community service. To understand the value of the assets you so casually sought to destroy. You will spend 8 hours picking up litter, cleaning porta potties, and generally making yourself useful. It will be logged and reported to me. If you fail to appear, your allowance will be terminated permanently, and the trust will pursue legal action for a conspiracy to commit criminal damage. Do you understand?" Thomas looked broken. His entire identity, the rebel, the outsider, the man of principle, had been revealed as a sham. He was just a rich kid playing at being poor, a vandal too stupid to know he was breaking his own windows. The fight was gone. The sneer was gone. All that was left was a confused and defeated young man. "I understand," he mumbled, and shuffled out of the room. He showed up at the construction site. I had the foreman send me pictures. There was Thomas, wearing a neon vest, sweat staining his shirt, hauling a bag of garbage, his face a mask of utter humiliation. He was learning the cost of things. The puppet had been forced to build the stage he wanted to burn down. The months rolled on. My family moved through their lives like sleepwalkers, their paths dictated by the whims of a ghost. Robert was consumed by the logistics project, a willing slave to a success that ultimately belonged to me. Cynthia became a ghost in her own social world, her magnificent gown a secret shame in a box in her closet. Elara trudged to her job and returned to her miserable apartment, her spirit slowly being sanded down by the grit of a mundane life. Thomas attended his activist meetings, but said nothing, a silent, haunted figure, his revolutionary fire extinguished by the cold water of reality. They were learning, they were compliant, but the masterpiece was not yet complete. A puppeteer's work is never done. I had broken their wills, but I hadn't yet forged them into something new. The next phase would be more subtle, more insidious. It was time to offer not just punishments, but rewards. A kind word, a reprieve, a glimpse of sunlight. But sunlight from my hand, on my terms. I had to make them love the hand that held the whip. I had to make them grateful for their chains. The real performance was about to begin. A year, a full turn of the planet around the sun, and my family continued their orbit around me, their gravity, their center, their silent, unseen star. The initial, brutal lessons had been learned. The shock had hardened into a dull, perpetual ache of acceptance. They were puppets who had felt the sharp tug of the strings and now moved with a cautious, hesitant familiarity, always anticipating the next pull. But a performance cannot sustain itself on fear and resentment alone. That's how revolutions are born. True. Enduring control requires a more sophisticated architecture. It requires a foundation of hope, walls of dependency, and a roof of carefully curated gratitude. I had been the architect of their despair. Now, I would become the architect of their fragile, Conditional happiness. It started with small things, strategic leniencies. I called them investment in morale. A puppeteer must occasionally grease the joints, lest they seize up and break. For Robert, it was a car, not just any car, a 1967 Jaguar E-Type, Series 1, in British racing green. It was his unobtainable dream car, a fantasy he'd whispered about 4 decades, a symbol of a swaggering, successful man had never had the courage to become. Had seen it at a classic car auction a month before my diagnosis, and had spoken of it with a longing usually reserved for a lost love. One Tuesday, Finch called him into the library. Robert entered, shoulders already slumped in anticipation of another tedious directive about quarterly reports. "Robert," Finch began, not looking up from his papers, "the trust has approved the disposal of a non-performing asset." Robert sighed. "Which one?" "The warehouse in Nevada." "A vehicular asset," Finch clarified. He slid a single key, attached to a simple leather fob, across the polished mahogany. "It's being transported to the south garage. See that it's properly maintained. The registration and insurance are in the glove box. The expense for upkeep will be covered under a new executive transportation line item." Robert stared at the key as if it were a live scorpion. He picked it up slowly. "I don't understand." "It's your father's," Finch lied, the falsehood rolling off his tongue with practiced ease. "He acquired it just before he passed. His final instruction was that it should go to you when the time was right. The trustee believes that time is now, in recognition of your satisfactory management of the logistics project." The change in Robert's face was a thing to behold. The perpetual tension melted away. His eyes, usually guarded and weary, shone with a boyish wonder. He looked from the key to my portrait, and for the first time, I saw not resentment or fear in his gaze, but something perilously close to affection. "Father," he whispered. He clutched the key in his fist, a tear tracing a path down his cheek. He didn't thank Finch. He looked up at my painted eyes and said, "Thank you." He practically ran to the garage. I watched him on the camera feed. He stood there for a full 10 minutes, just staring at the car, his hand resting on its flawless curves. Then he got in, started the engine, the sound was a glorious, throaty roar, and began to weep. Great, heaving sobs of joy and grief and confused gratitude. He was mine. I had given him the symbol of his masculinity, and in doing so, I had emasculated him more completely than any corporate directive ever could. He would drive that car, and every time he turned the key, he would think of me. The puppet loves the gift, forgetting it is just another string. For Cynthia, the olive branch was more social. Eleanor Vanderwoodson, her arch-nemesis, was chairing the annual library fundraiser. Cynthia, of course, had not been asked to be on the committee. Her exile was nearly complete. A week before the event, Finch summoned her. She entered the library like a prisoner approaching the warden, her eyes downcast. "Cynthia," he said, "a matter has come to my attention. The Grove Park Library Gala." She flinched. "I'm aware of it. I'm not involved." "You are now," Finch said. "The trust is making a significant donation, $500,000, and it has been stipulated that you are to be named co-chair of the event, alongside Mrs. Vanderwoodson." Cynthia's head snapped up. Her mouth fell open. "What?" "But Eleanor would never the committee. The donation has been accepted." "The condition has been agreed to," Finch said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Mrs. Vanderwoodson will be calling you this afternoon to discuss the arrangements." He slid a black American Express card across the desk. It had her name on it. "This is for event-related expenses. All receipts must be submitted. There is no preset limit, but profligacy will be noted." She took the card as if it were made of crystal. The power, the status, the utter humiliation of her rivalate was all being handed to her. The victory she had craved was being delivered on a silver platter, paid for with my money. "Why?" she breathed, her voice trembling. "Why now?" Finch allowed a rare, thin smile. "Your father-in-law believed in supporting the arts, and he believed you were the best person to represent the family's philanthropic interests. He noted your social talents. It was a lie, of course. I thought the library was a tedious monument to dead trees, but the effect was electric. Cynthia's spine straightened. The color returned to her cheeks. She was being recognized, validated, by me. From beyond the grave, the profound, soul-crushing unfairness of the past year was suddenly recontextualized. It wasn't cruelty. It was a test, and she had passed. The box gown in her closet was no longer a taunt. It was a prophecy about to be fulfilled. She left the library a woman transformed. She called Eleanor, her voice dripping with a condescending sweetness that was a weapon in itself. Eleanor, darling. Yes, isn't it wonderful? Semio always did have such faith in me to get things done. She went to the gala. She wore the blue gown. She was magnificent. She ruled the room. And every time someone complimented her on the event, she would say, "Thank you. It's all thanks to the generosity of my late father in Norse Trust. He's still looking out for us, you know." She had become my evangelist. The puppet not only dances, but praises the puppeteer to the audience. Elara's reward was simpler, more brutal. She had been a good girl. She'd kept her job. She'd endured her miserable apartment. She'd learned the value of $1. It was time to show her the value of my $1. One Friday, she came home from work to find an eviction notice on her door. The building had been sold. The new owners were converting to condos. Panic seized her. The East Side rental market was a nightmare. On her budget, she was facing homelessness. She called Finch in a blind hysteric, sobbing down the phone. He listened patiently, then told her to come to the house. She arrived, a wreck of smudged mascara and despair. "They're kicking me out, Mr. Finch. I have 30 days. I can't find anything. What am I going to do?" Finch let her cry for a moment before speaking. "The trust is aware of the situation. Your grandfather anticipated potential instability in the rental market." Another smooth, effortless lie. I had orchestrated the sale of the building through 3 shell corporations. As it happens, the trust holds a number of properties. There is a small condominium available, 2 bedrooms, in the North Park district. Alara's tears stopped. North Park was trendy, vibrant, full of coffee shops and boutiques. It was a world away from her current dump. North Park. But I could never afford. The trust will cover the mortgage and condo fees, Finch said. It will be considered part of your housing allowance. You will be responsible for utilities. The building has a gym, a rooftop terrace, and secure parking. He showed her pictures on his tablet. It was beautiful, light-filled, modern, with a balcony overlooking a tree-lined street. It was everything her current life was not. She was speechless. The relief was so profound it left her weak. I don't know what to say. "Thank you, Mr. Finch. Thank you so much. Thank your grandfather," he said, nodding toward my portrait. It was his foresight. She moved in 2 weeks later. The joy she felt in her new home was directly proportional to the misery she had felt in the old one. I had created the problem and provided the solution. I was her savior, her landlord, her god. The puppet is happiest when the puppeteer loosens the string just enough to let her believe she's flying on her own. Thomas was the hardest nut to crack. His humiliation at the construction site had been complete, but it had left him sullen and withdrawn. Had stopped going to meetings altogether. He just stayed in his apartment, brooding. His allowance piled up in his bank account, untouched. He was starving himself of everything, even the money he now accepted, as a form of protest. It was pathetic. He needed a purpose, a direction for his angry, misplaced energy, something that felt like rebellion, but was, in fact, ultimate submission. Finch summoned him. Thomas arrived, his face a closed door. "Thomas," Finch began, dispensing with any preamble. "The trust is establishing a new charitable foundation, the Semio Locke Foundation for Urban Justice." Thomas blinked, his mask of indifference cracking for a second. "What?" "It will focus on grant funding for community-led initiatives, affordable housing advocacy, environmental justice, youth outreach programs, the kind of causes you have expressed interest in." "This is a joke," Thomas said, his voice flat. "It is not," Finch replied. The trust is endowing it with $10 million, and we are looking for an executive director." He let the words hang in the air. Thomas stared at him, trying to find the trick. "The salary is $120,000 a year," Finch continued. "You will have an office, a staff, a budget. You will be responsible for vetting grant applications, managing the funds, and overseeing the foundation's operations. You will report directly to me." Thomas laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You want me to be your pet radical, to whitewash the family's conscience with blood money? No thanks, I won't be your token." "The alternative," Finch said calmly, "is that the $10 million remains invested in oil futures and private prisons. Your choice. You can stand on the outside and throw rocks, accomplishing nothing. Or you can get inside the machine and try to steer it, however slightly. Your grandfather believed in pragmatism over ideology. This is your inheritance. You can use it to make an actual difference, or you can continue your performative self-pity. The trustee does not care either way." It was a masterstroke. I was offering him everything he claimed to want: money, power, a platform to do good. But it was my money, my platform. To refuse was to admit his principles were a hollow pose. To accept was to become a servant of the very system he hated, to spend his life trying to mitigate the damage done by the wealth that paid his salary. He would be forever trapped in a paradox of his own making. He was silent for a long time. I could see the war raging behind his eyes. The idealist versus the pragmatist, the rebel versus the heir. Who decides on the grants? He finally asked, his voice hoarse. "You do," Finch said. "Subject to final approval by the trustee, of course, to ensure the foundation's goals aligned with the trust's broader philanthropic vision." My vision, the final string. Thomas took the job. He told himself he was infiltrating the beast. He was going to use their money against them. He was a mole, a double agent. The truth was, had just been given a very comfortable cage. He threw himself into the work with a furious intensity. He was good at it. He found legitimate, worthy causes. He fought with Finch over every approval, every dollar, believing he was fighting the good fight. He didn't realize that the fight itself was the performance I had written for him. His rebellion had been channeled, institutionalized, and put on a direct deposit payroll. The puppet believes he is dancing a dance of defiance, but the puppeteer chose the music. 2 years passed. The machine I had built hummed along with a terrible, beautiful efficiency. My family were no longer just prisoners, they were willing participants in their own captivity. They had found a perverse kind of peace in it. The uncertainty was gone. The rules were clear. Behave, and you will be rewarded. Step out of line, and you will be corrected. Their lives were comfortable, predictable, and utterly owned. Robert ran my company with a diligent, fearful competence. So grateful for his Jaguar and the occasional word of praise from Finch that he never again questioned his lack of real authority. Cynthia ruled the social roost, her every charity event, every new designer bag, a testament to my posthumous generosity. She was my greatest ambassador, forever singing the praises of dear, departed Semio. Alara thrived in her condo, and even got a promotion at the dermatology clinic. Her life a comfortable, middle-class dream entirely funded and controlled by me. And Thomas was my favorite. He worked 80-hour weeks for his foundation, his hair growing shaggier, his clothes still thrift store, but his bank account swelling. He was changing the world, one small, trust-approved grant at a time. He hated me more than ever, and he served me more faithfully than any of them. They were all happy, in their way, and their happiness was the final, absolute proof of my victory. I began to grow bored. The reports from Finch were now exercises in monotony. Robert exceeded profit projections. Cynthia hosted a successful ballet fundraiser. Alara was considering night classes in business administration. Thomas Foundation had funded a new community garden. It was also tidy. The thrill of the game was fading. There was no more resistance to break, no more wills to bend. A puppeteer needs an audience, and my audience, my family, had become so accustomed to the show, they no longer saw the strings. They no longer saw me. I needed a reminder, a grand finale, a moment so shocking, so personal, that the illusion would shatter, and they would see the ghost in the machine, clear and terrible and undeniable. I wanted them to know, beyond any doubt, that I was still there, watching, pulling, always. The opportunity came from an unexpected source, my portrait. The painting had been my eyes and ears for years, but it was a passive observer. I wanted a more active conduit. Technology had advanced. Finch, ever the loyal executor, had kept me apprised. There were devices now. Small, powerful speakers, microphones of incredible sensitivity, a projector. We devised a plan. It was audacious, risky. It could break the carefully constructed reality I had built. But I was bored, and a ghost has nothing to lose. It was the anniversary of my death. The family had developed a ritual, a dreadfully somber dinner at the house, under the gaze of my portrait. They hated it, but it was mandated by the trust. Another one of my posthumous whims. They gathered in the dining room. The atmosphere was funereal, as usual. Robert picked at his food. Cynthia made forced, polite conversation about a recent museum exhibition shed, attended thanks to her trust-funded membership. Elara checked her phone under the table. Thomas sat in sullen silence, no doubt mentally calculating how much the cost of the meal would have funded for his foundation. Finch was there, as always, the silent overseer at the foot of the table. The dinner dragged on. The tension was palpable. They were going through the motions, waiting for the ordeal to be over. Then, as the dessert was being cleared, Finch stood up. He tapped his water glass with a spoon. "A moment, if you please," he said. The family looked up, surprised. Finch never spoke at these dinners. On this, the anniversary of Semio's passing, he began, his voice unusually solemn. "The trust has mandated that I share a final communication." He walked to a small sideboard and opened a drawer. He took out a sleek, black remote control. He pointed it at my portrait. A soft, mechanical whirring sound came from behind the canvas. The entire painting, frame and all, began to slide silently upward, disappearing into a recess in the ceiling. In its place was a large, blank, matte white screen. The family stared, utterly bewildered. "What is this, Alistair?" Robert asked, his voice uneasy. "A recording," Finch said. "A message your father left for this specific occasion." He pressed a button on the remote. The screen flickered to life. But it wasn't a recording of me from my later years. It was me from about 10 years ago. I looked vital, fierce, my eyes sharp and clear. I was sitting in my study, in my favorite leather wingback chair. I smiled, a thin, knowing smile. The family gasped. Elara dropped her phone. Cynthia clutched her pearls. Thomas leaned forward, his brow furrowed. The me on the screen began to speak. The audio was crystal clear, my voice filling the room, strong and commanding, not the weaker rasp of my final years. "Hello, family," the recording of me said. "If you're seeing this, then Finch has determined that the time is right. 2 years, is it? 3. I hope you've settled in." The familiarity of my voice, the casual cruelty in my tone, was a shock. They were frozen in their seats. "I imagine this annual dinner is a dreary affair," I continued, chuckling softly. "All of you sitting there, eating my food, in my house, wondering what fresh hell Owell has in store for you next. Don't bother denying it. I know you. I've always known you." My on-screen eyes seemed to sweep across the room, pinning each of them in turn. "Robert, my diligent son, how is the Jaguar running? I trust you're still taking orders from that Evans woman. She's got more spine in her little finger than you have in your entire body. But you do try, I'll give you that." Robert's face went ashen. He shrunk in his chair. "Cynthia, still spending money like it's water, I expect. I trust the library gala was a success. Did you finally put that dreadful Eleanor van der Woodson in her place? It's amusing, really. All that social climbing. And the only reason you're at the top of the ladder is because I'm holding it for you." Cynthia's mouth was a tight, thin line of fury and humiliation. "Elara, my dear, I hope the new condo is to your liking. Much better than that hovel above the laundromat wasn't it? A girl needs her comforts. And how is the receptionist job? Teaching you the value of $1, of my dollar. Alara looked like she'd been slapped. Tears welled in her eyes. And Thomas, the on-screen me sighed. A theatrical sound of disappointment. My little revolutionary. How's the foundation? Funding all sorts of noble causes with the very wealth you claim to despise. The hypocrisy must be a heavy burden. But don't worry, you're not a sellout. You're just pragmatic, like your grandfather. Thomas shot to his feet, his chair screeching backward. Turn it off, he yelled at Finch. Turn it off now. Finch didn't move. The recording continued. I know this must be difficult to hear, I said, my smile widening. But it's important for you to understand. This isn't a recording. Not in the way you think. The on-screen me leaned forward, closer to the camera, my face filling the screen. The effect was terrifyingly intimate. This is a live feed. A dead silence fell over the room. They didn't understand. The technology is quite remarkable, the me on the screen said, gesturing vaguely. A high-resolution projection, since to a pre-recorded avatar. But the voice you're hearing, the words, that's me. Right now. I let that hang in the air. The confusion on their faces was delicious. The doctors gave me 6 months, I continued. They were wrong. The cancer one. But I had other plans. A full cognitive digitization. A neural map. An echo, if you will. It's not a perfect copy. It's me. My consciousness. My will. My memories. Running on a bank of servers in a secure facility Finch arranged. I see everything. I hear everything. The cameras in your homes, the microphones, the financial transactions, the reports from Finch. I am still here. The truth crashed down on them. It wasn't a will. It wasn't a trust. It wasn't even a ghost. It was a ghost in the machine. Literally. The portrait was just for show, I said, my voice dripping with amusement. A comforting anachronism. This is what I've become. This is how I watch. This is how I control. Forever. Robert was hyperventilating. Cynthia had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. Alara was sobbing quietly. Thomas stood rigid, his fists clenched, staring at the screen with pure, undiluted horror. Why? Robert choked out, his question aimed at the screen. At me. Why would you do this? The on-screen me smiled, a cold, terrible smile. Because, Robert, I said, my voice softening into a horrific parody of paternal affection, you are my masterpiece. All of you. An artist never truly abandons his work. This dinner isn't an anniversary of my death. It's a celebration of my everlasting life. Your lives are my life. Your strings are my strings. Forever. I paused, letting the full, horrific weight of eternity settle upon them. Now, I said, my tone becoming brisk, businesslike. Let's discuss the quarterly reports. Robert, I've been reviewing the numbers from the Asian division. They are not acceptable. We need to talk about your performance. The screen continued to speak, laying out directives, critiquing, controlling. The family sat there, trapped in their dining room chairs, forced to listen to the voice of their dead patriarch, who wasn't dead at all, but something infinitely worse. They were not just puppets. They were the permanent, living exhibit in the museum of me, and the show would never, ever end. Finch stood by the door, watching them, a faint, satisfied smile on his lips. The executor and the executed, together in the same room, bound for eternity. The puppeteer had finally taken his final bow, and revealed that he would never, ever leave the stage.